All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today for our seminar. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Just a reminder, today's seminar is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the Research Program Manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, and I will be your host. For folks online, we do have your camera, mics, and screen shares turned off, but we do hope that you ask us questions. Just put those into the chat box, and our volunteer, Roseanne, will help monitor any technical issues you're having or read out any questions for our speaker. For folks in the room, if you have any questions at the end of today's talk, just raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic, and that way folks online can participate in our conversation as well. Just wanted to do a quick little announcement for next week's seminar. Next week we have David Taylor. This was a talk that was scheduled and we had to reschedule it, so I'm excited that he's going to be able to be here. He's a postdoctoral researcher with the Coombs group here at Hatfield, and he's going to be talking about leveraging stable isotopes to answer questions about species response to a changing environment. So I'm hoping that you all can come back for next week. But I'm actually just going to get this started because I'm excited for this talk, and I'm going to hand this off to Kate Stafford. She works closely with today's speaker, and she's going to do our introduction.
And I'm going to be nice. Thank you, Cinnamon. It's my great pleasure to introduce Angela Szesciorka. She's been a postdoc in the Marine Mammal Biology and Ecology Lab for the past 2 years. She started and got a master's degree from Moss Landing, and she sort of lowered the bar in getting it in fewer than 8 years. Oh. Hey, no heckling. You can heckle the speaker. And then she got her PhD in oceanography from Scripps. Since 2022, she's been here as an NSF postdoctoral fellow in the Office of Polar Programs. And Angie has been, not only did she hit the ground running, she's stayed running the whole time she's been here. In 2023, she had 5 papers published, 3 of which were first author. She's going to have another one out in a couple weeks, and we've been collaborating on a book chapter. So this woman does not let the moss grow under her feet. And this is going to be a really exciting, interesting talk. And so I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Angie.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Speaking of moss growing on feet, let's see if I can get these slides going. So I'm starting with this animation. I hope no one gets motion sickness because it's flying around a bunch. So this is all the places that I have lived. And I didn't even include all the times I moved within a city, but I've made 19 major moves in my life. My dad was in the military, so early on we were moving every 2 to 3 years, although I realize now that that is still happening. I'm still moving every couple of years, so I have not slowed down. So as someone who's clearly always on the go, it should be of no surprise that I'm interested in animal movement and migration, the where, the when, and the why. It's still going. There, Newport. All right, so I think it's really cool that not only does every major animal taxa migrate, but it evolved independently. So anywhere from birds, bats, invertebrates, fish, amphibians, marine mammals, they all migrate. It's different among species and within species. So it can vary, depending on age, sex, population size, things like reproductive status. And those differences present themselves in differences in the initiation of timing of migration, the distances traveled, routes that are taken, and even behavior along the migration routes. And there's many different types of migration, and it's a little hard to define, but it generally includes persistent movement, relocation on a greater scale than normal, seasonal movement between 2 areas, and a redistribution of the entire population. And typically migration is motivated by something. So early on, when my dad was in the military, I didn't have the choice of where I got to migrate. So that's considered obligate migration. But now I have a choice. It's facultative migration. And I would say that the motivation behind my migration is resource tracking, also known as jobs. So that's why I'm moving around so much. Migration is expressed in many different ways, depending on the species and all the other things I just talked about. But I'll walk you through a few examples. And keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list. One example is wildebeest herds in Tanzania. So they perform what we call nomadic migration. They're kind of wandering in a non-specific manner, and their motivation is food. So they're looking for areas with adequate food. But the monarch butterfly, which migrates between Canada and Mexico, they're actually migrating to avoid cold temperatures in the winter. And so this actually will take them several generations to get from Canada to Mexico. These guys only live, I think, 2 to 6 weeks. So the animals that arrive in Mexico are not the ones that started out the journey. So this is a multi-generational migration. And if we're thinking about whales, and I think we all are, because that's why we're here today, this is kind of the most common form migration for baleen whales. It's this classical seasonal to and fro migration, typically over long distances. This is just a kind of a schematic of the basic humpback whale migration routes, and it's typically from lower latitude breeding grounds to higher latitude feeding grounds. But we'll take a very brief step back. I promise we won't get into this too much, but let's talk about the evolution of migration. We didn't have the first mysticete until about 35 million years ago during the Eocene. And then migration itself in baleen whales really only traces back to the Pliocene, so about 5 million years ago. This occurred after upwelling in the oceans became kind of created these seasonal prey, patchy prey areas. And this was also around the same time we started getting gigantism, so the giant whales that we see today. And that is it for the history lesson, because the reason I brought you all here today is because I love marine mammal drama. The marine mammal world is awesome, but I discovered this kind of series of papers that I wanted to talk to you about. A, because if you don't know about it, you should track them down and read them. They're all very interesting. And B, because I'm a little obsessed, because this started 25 years ago. And these researchers in the marine mammal world have been debating each other, not only in person, but in peer-reviewed published journal articles about why baleen whales migrate, specifically why whales return to their breeding grounds every year. And I'm going to walk you through a few of the arguments. So it all started in 1999 when Corcoran and Connor published this paper, Why Do Baleen Whales Migrate? They walked through a series of arguments basically to say, does this make sense? So they said, it's not to conserve energy. They did kind of the physiological modeling and said it doesn't make sense for adults. It's not really an evolutionary holdover because a lot of animals in some populations don't migrate at all, so that doesn't make sense. It could be resource tracking, but what they were saying was that animals, these large whales, aren't feeding on their breeding grounds, and so they're not tracking any resources when they go there. They decided that calves in colder waters are still thermoneutral, so it has nothing to do with calf thermoregulation. They also talked about the fact that, maybe it's that these calmer waters are shallower and it's easier for calves to swim in and survive in. But they said, well, there's a bunch of small odontocetes found in colder waters and they're doing just fine. Plus there's, shallow waters in temperate, higher latitude areas. So that doesn't make sense either. So what they came upon was that it might likely be because of predator avoidance, especially for newborn whales. So basically they were saying whales migrate to the breeding grounds to avoid killer whale predation. But then Clapham, and a couple of years later, he published this and he was like, I don't know, that doesn't really make sense. Let me tell you why. And he was like, well, look, there's killer whales found in the tropics too. And we're not seeing these huge aggregations of killer whales in the winter there, which they should if they were smart, because if all the whales are aggregated in the winter together and they're all singing, that's kind of like a dinner bell. Like, why aren't we seeing that? He also said that, even at the feeding grounds, there's few attacks of, and in his example, he was really focusing on humpbacks, but he said, we don't see, attacks of killer whales on humpbacks. So it's unlikely that this is even a major food source for killer whales. And so he basically was like, why bother selecting for this if it involves moving around from areas where they're going to face risk to even get to the breeding grounds? So, his conclusion was that this is to conserve energy in warm waters so that calves can grow and develop. But then Connor and Corcoran came back and they were like, thank you so much, sir, but we think you misunderstood us. Basically, they were saying the critical focus for our argument was on extremely, like when they're first born. So by the time they're migrating back to the feeding grounds, they're a little larger, they're less likely to be attacked. So really, it's just the first few weeks after they're born that we think they need to be protected. they said, hey, we didn't dismiss the other hypotheses. We just said they were less likely. And then they reiterated that the predation risk at the breeding grounds was probably lower than if all the whales remained at the feeding grounds. Like it gets them away from the higher density of killer whales. So they, that was kind of their reasoning. They also pointed out, rightfully so, is that we don't see too many predations, or at least we didn't at the time. We have seen them since, but we also don't see mating in the wild either. Really, until recently, we didn't even see whales giving birth. So they were basically like, just because we didn't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And then what I think was really interesting is they said that the predation rates that we're seeing now, maybe it doesn't even match the historic predation rates, because we all know that during commercial whaling, we removed a bunch of whales from the ecosystem. And so we're only seeing with, what's going on right now. So that was all fine. And then some time passed and perhaps this debate was forgotten. Then Clapham came back in 2017 and he published, again, in Marine Mammal Science. These were all in Marine Mammal Science, the journal. And he basically said, I went to a conference, the Marine Mammal Conference, a couple years ago. This came out in 2017, so I'm thinking it was the one in San Francisco. And he was like, we debated it again, and you guys changed my mind. He basically was like, I thought it through. That makes the most sense. And I just like that he called it a rip-roaring debate. And there was a little cheeky language in some of the papers, but basically that everyone was very respectable and got along. And so that was kind of the end of this, which I think is very interesting, gave us a lot to think about. But in the background of all of this, Durbin and Pittman had published in 2012, and they had documented killer whales in Antarctica with yellow on their skin when they first arrived, and then they were, well, sorry, not in Antarctica, coming from Antarctica. And when they left the warmer waters, they were clean. And so they were kind of like, well, maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe it's like a physiology thing that's driving this migration. And so then Pittman et al. In 2019 published a larger paper on this, and they basically documented diatoms on killer whales, blue fins, say humpback, sperm whales, even dolphins. And their belief was that by conserving their body heat when they're in Antarctica, it allows the diatoms to accumulate. And so that they make these periodic trips to warmer waters from Antarctica so that it would help, the warm water would help, help their skin slough essentially. So fall off the body and they can clean themselves that way. And so they called this the feeding molting hypothesis. And it was super interesting. And I think most people thought it was new. First of all, Clapham, Connor, and Corcoran didn't discuss this, so that was kind of cool. Some people were like, it makes sense in Antarctica, it makes sense with killer whales, but the questions kind of remain about why do whales migrate? And what's really interesting is not every species, not every population of baleen whales migrate. Geiger et al. Compiled this really cool table. The one you're seeing here is kind of a condensed version, but if you go to the paper, it's got every population listed out within each species to talk about, are they full migrators? Are they partial migrators? Do they not migrate at all? And so the list on the left is just a few examples of some whales populations that don't migrate. So humpbacks in the Arabian Sea, blue whales in the northern Indian Ocean, pygmy blue whales in New Zealand, O'Mura's whale in the Indian Ocean, and even fin whales off Southern California aren't believed to migrate. So it does leave open a lot of questions as to why whales migrate or why they don't migrate. And so for whatever the reason that modern whales migrate, the annual migration, it's complex. They're moving between these discrete feeding and breeding grounds. And so it involves a lot of internal and external processes. So obviously there's some evolution involved, but it does involve genetics, physiology, even things like cultural transmission. So how do you even know when or why or where to migrate? Who do you learn that from? You're drawing on your memory, so spatial and temporal memory of where prey distributions are, not only in recent times, but over longer time periods. And then, of course, as you're migrating, that includes real-time perception. You have to know where to go once you start getting there. And because whales are migrating really long distances between their breeding and feeding grounds, they also need to time this migration just right so that they can arrive when the food is in the greatest availability to them. And so this is that mismatch hypothesis. It's been studied in a lot of animals, especially birds, but it does apply to whales as well. So there are a number of ways that whale migration has been studied, and it actually does date back to when we were killing whales commercially. So basically, if you know where whales are, you can kill them, kill more of them and kill them more efficiently. And so they created these mark recapture darts, essentially, that they would put into the blubber of the whales. And then they would let the whale live. The whale would go on its merry way for the time being. And if then it got caught and killed somewhere else, as they're chopping up the blubber, they would find these little tags essentially that had the serial number. That would allow them to then go back and reconstruct where the whale was tagged, where it was killed, and kind of put together a path of, how did it get where it ended up. And it allowed people to put together these little crude maps that showed like, these are all the different species, where they're found and what time of year. And all of that, of course, allowed whalers to exploit, this more and kill more whales, but it also helped us learn a lot about, the rudimentary origins of whale migration. Obviously, there's other ways you could do that. This is visual surveys. In both of these cases, actually, the bottom left one is down in Piedras Blancas, and then top right one is off Oregon here. And so basically, they're just standing on shore, visually watching as gray whales migrate by, and you can count how many you see in a given year, and that gives you a sense of the timing and how many and where they are. And so that's another option. This one is just an interesting one. It's not one that I think is used very often, but barnacles are attached to whales and whales are moving. And so as the barnacles grow, they kind of imprint in their layers oxygen levels of the time and place where they were. So you can actually use that to reconstruct not only migration routes, but the time of the year that occurred. And so scientists have been able to use this on really historic samples too, to compare how does modern migration compare to more ancient migration. So it's a really cool method. And then obviously satellite tagging is probably one of the most ones that comes to mind when talking about migration. So basically you're attaching a tag onto a whale. It's connected to the satellites, so it's sending GPS positions. And you've probably seen this figure before, but basically if you get enough animals tagged, you can start to compile what this was the whale superhighways that Daniel's lab contributed data to see like globally where are all the whales going. And you can even see here if you squint, like you can really tell where some of the migration routes start and end for some of these different species. But our lab uses acoustics, specifically passive acoustic monitoring, to track whales, vocalizing animals, not only in real time, but across many years. Passive acoustic monitoring, compared to some of the other methods that are still used, it can be lower cost. It can be used day, night, in rain, in the darkness, under ice. So it really allows us to explore some of these questions about habitat use. You can identify some species that you've never even seen. So there are some beaked whales we've only ever heard. You can get at things like abundance. So there's a bunch of different things acoustics is used for. And because you're probably like, okay, why acoustics? So acoustics are really important in the ocean. So animals not only listen for sound passively, but they produce sounds as well. And they're, anywhere from oysters to snapping shrimp to sharks. That's a Weddell seal there. They're using these sounds for settlement cues, foraging, defense, navigation, migration, communication, courtship, mating, you name it. That's what sound is all important for them. So there's a lot of sound being produced in the ocean. And one of the reasons for that is that as you go deeper and deeper into the ocean, there's less light available. And so without light, these animals need another way to navigate, communicate, find prey, and mate. And so they can rely on other senses like smell and taste, but in the ocean, sound travels 4.5 times faster than it does in air. And so in the absence of light, this is really the best method for understanding your environment. And because it's so important to them, we can kind of eavesdrop and listen and learn as much about them as we can, including migration patterns. And so keeping that in mind, we're going to talk about 2 case studies in which we used passive acoustic monitoring to study migration timing and patterns. And these are very 2 different baleen whale species, one that migrates between the tropics and temperate waters, and one that lives entirely in the Arctic. And so we'll talk about these 2, and then we'll revisit that migration debate at the end. So the Eastern North Pacific blue whale, they travel thousands of miles between their winter breeding grounds in the Costa Rica Dome and their summer feeding grounds, which really spans from Mexico all the way up to California, Oregon, and Washington. And they're migrating up in the spring, and then when they get there, they're feeding on these really 2 lipid-rich euphausid species that they prefer. They sometimes go all the way up, some stay in Southern California, but eventually in the fall, they start making their way down and go back to the Costa Rica Dome for the winter. The last estimate for this population was anywhere between 1,700 and 1,900 individuals. Some people think they're reaching carrying capacity. A recent study, though, pointed out that about 3,500 were removed from whaling, so they may be recovering. There's some debate there. Then we have the bowhead whales. This is the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort population of bowhead whales. They spend winter in the northwestern Bering Sea. And then in the spring, they migrate through the Bering Strait. They turn right past Alaska, and then they spend the whole summer feeding on copepods mostly, but also krill in the eastern Canadian Beaufort Sea. In the fall, they will then head westward through the Chukchi Sea. They'll head south through the Bering Strait and then back into the northwestern Bering Sea for the winter. And these guys, there's actually probably anywhere from 16,000 to 27,000, so a lot more compared to the blue whales. They are also believed to be close to their pre-whaling numbers. And this population is actually compared to, there's 3 other populations of bowheads up in the Arctic, but these guys are doing really well. They're very well managed. So since we're talking about acoustics, thank God for us, all baleen whales, like blue whales, are very vocal. So we're looking at some spectrograms here. It's basically just a visual representations of sound. So on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is frequency. And one of the calls that blue whales produce is called a D call. It's kind of a multi-purpose social feeding call. It's produced by both sexes. And I have a little sound for you to listen to for that. Very low frequency, very bassy sound. But the males of blue whales, they all produce a series of calls. This one is a B call, but usually it's repeated with A calls, and it's considered song. So we believe it has a reproductive or mating function. And here's what this B call sounds like. It's also very bassy, very low frequency. And very simple. You know, they have these repeated notes as song, but it's a pretty simple song. But when you compile all this, you know, passive acoustic data and then start looking at it, so now we're looking at the D calls are in green and then the song is in blue, you can start to see there's a seasonal pattern here. And then you can start to say, okay, if this is a hydrophone sitting in a fixed location, when did the animal arrive and when did it leave? And you can also see how different the 2 call types are, where there's a ton of song in the fall and winter. Okay, and now we're going to switch over to bowhead whales. They're also luckily very vocal. Similar layout. So the top is we don't actually have a name for this. They just have calls. We don't name them because they're harder to identify for the time being. Hannah hopefully will get some calls put together. So this is what that sounds like. Also pretty simple, less bassy, sounds pretty cool. But is really cool about bowhead whales is that they're very similar to humpbacks, but better. In that they also produce this really beautifully complex song. And I'll play just a small snippet of that. Okay, so that's that. Very beautiful. But tricky because as you can see with the song too, it's really hard to isolate if you were going to count the number of times you saw an animal singing. So typically what we end up doing is saying, are these whales present or not within an hour? And so then now what we're looking at here instead of number of calls is how many hours over the migratory season did we have each of these call types? And it's somewhat similar. It's a little misleading because this is number of hours, so it's not number of calls, but it does show you that there's some seasonality. You have definitely more singing, especially in the winter. So we have all these call types. Now we have all this data we need to collect. So we had the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. There's a couple of bioacoustics labs there. When I was there, they were deploying these high frequency acoustic recording packages or HARPs off Southern California. I focused on these 5 sites because basically as the whales are migrating northward from the Costa Rica Dome, essentially most of them are going to pass through these hydrophones, so we could capture their migration through their vocalizations. And then similarly up in the Arctic, there's 3 hydrophones that I was looking at, and these have been deployed by the University of Washington for many years. And so we've got a site just north of the Bering Strait. We've got a site in the Western Beaufort Sea, and then another one at the Chukchi Plateau. And this is a much more complicated mooring because up in Alaska, it's a lot harder to do field work. And so if you're getting a vessel to go out there to put hydrophones in, oftentimes you'll put as many sensors on as you can so you can collect as much data as possible. So there's physical and biological and chemical sensors on here. And for both of these data sets, we had about roughly 10 years of data to go through. So I'll walk you through some of the environmental drivers that I found when I was looking at what drove the timing of the migration for these two species. It's possible that it's a number or a combination of some of these drivers, as well as some of the other things that mechanisms behind migration, but I'll just show you some of the correlative relationships that I found. So for blue whales, we found that their timing, especially when they arrived in Southern California, was really strongly linked to sea surface temperature. And what was really cool about this too is that it wasn't just sea surface temperature, it was what was the sea surface temperature from the previous year. And so if it was cold one year, they would actually arrive earlier the next year. And if it was warm that year, they would arrive at their feeding grounds later the next year. So a really interesting relationship. And the reason behind that was that if you had colder water one year, the next year there was actually going to be more krill. And so if it was warmer water, you would end up having less krill the next year. So perhaps they were kind of timing this migration, knowing that colder waters one year mean there's going to be good krill the next year. And so they can kind of time that out. And if it was warmer, less krill, maybe smaller krill, they could kind of take their time and get to the feeding grounds whenever they felt like they were ready. And the other thing that was really interesting about that relationship was that when there was more krill, because of the colder waters, they could kind of get done. Basically, they got there earlier. They were able to eat a bunch early on, and then they could switch. So they went from that social multi-purpose feeding call to their breeding call sooner. So essentially, they're fat, happy, and healthy. Now they can think about what they really care about, which is reproduction. Okay, so now we're going to switch back to bowhead whales. They were kind of the opposite. So instead of being linked to sea surface temperature, they were actually really strongly linked to sea ice, which makes sense. There's a lot of sea ice up where they live. So if we're kind of also switching it. So instead of now thinking about going to the feeding grounds, these guys are going to the breeding grounds, so swapping. And so when they're starting this southward migration through the Bering Strait, this had a really strong link to sea ice. And it was linked to sea ice area up in the Chukchi Sea, so where they're coming from as they're migrating southward. And so if there was less sea ice, they could actually take their time and stay north for longer. But if there was more sea ice, it kind of forced them to migrate through the Bering Strait earlier in the season. And then once, these animals are coming through, typically they're spending all winter in the Bering Sea. So I looked at how many days were they absent from the Bering Strait region. And so I found here, now as sea ice is growing through the Chukchi Sea, then it starts to grow through the Bering Sea. And so for this case, they were, this kind of absence period was really strongly linked to sea ice in the Bering Sea. And so if there was more sea ice, they were absent from this area for longer. And if there was less sea ice, they were able to kind of stay north and just be up there for a longer period of time before they might have to vacate and go down to the Bering Sea. And then if we look, finally, now we're in the spring, so they're ready to make their northward migration through the Bering Strait so they can go feed. This also, similarly to the southward migration, was really tied to sea ice in the Chukchi Sea. So again, if there was less sea ice, they could migrate through the Bering Strait sooner. And if there was more sea ice, they had to wait for the sea ice to recede before they could actually start going through the Chukchi Sea and head over to the Beaufort Sea. So that was kind of, what's driving that interannual variability in migration timing. But as we all know, the world is changing because of climate change. We've got, increasing temperatures and all sorts of things happening. So I also wanted to look at what's the long-term trend in migration timing and how does that relate to some of these environmental variables that we looked at. And so we know that ocean temperatures are increasing. You can see in the bottom left, that's the same time period for when I was looking at the blue whale migration patterns. And you can see that it's been off Southern California, sea surface temperatures have been increasing over this 10-year period. And at the same time, blue whales have started arriving earlier and earlier every year at the Southern California feeding grounds. There's still obviously a lot of that interannual variability signal in there, but as a whole, they're arriving 1 month earlier than they were before. This was 2008 all the way out to 2017. And so some people think that as it's getting warmer, the spring bloom, or when upwelling occurs and when all their food starts to grow, that's happening earlier and earlier. So they're kind of trying to keep up with that. And for bowhead whales, it's kind of it is also warming really rapidly up in the Arctic, but what we're really seeing is a strong decline in sea ice up in the Arctic. And so one trend that stood out for that was things like bowhead whales staying later at their feeding grounds. So this is the hydrophone off the Western Beaufort Sea. So basically when they leave that period and head east to go back down to the Bering Sea, they were delaying their departure by 45 days by the end of the study. So staying longer at their feeding grounds. The other thing that we looked at was how many days did we have data, and of that, how many days did we have calls? And so for both of these sites, the Western Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Plateau, we saw more calling behaviors, more calling days to indicate that they're spending more time at these hydrophones. And what that tells us is that potentially they're expanding on their summer feeding habitats. So they're spending more time over in the Chukchi Sea and the Chukchi Shelf feeding. So not only are they staying longer at their feeding grounds, but they're potentially expanding on where they go when they're feeding. And bowhead whales are a little different in that they will feed opportunistically year round. So they will go over to the Chukchi Sea if there's food there. And then the last bit that was really interesting for us was that period of time when whales would be absent in the winter when they were supposed to be in the Bering Sea, that basically dropped dramatically after 2 years into our study period. And so what we think is happening is that now a lot of these whales, we don't actually know how many, but we think some whales at least are spending winter north of the Bering Sea instead of going into the Bering Sea anymore. So a shift not only in the timing, but in the patterns of where they overwinter. And so a lot of that was a lot of information I just threw at you, but basically what we found, was that there's interannual trends in for both of these whales, one driven by ocean temperatures, one driven by sea ice. So there is a bit of plasticity in how these whales respond from year to year to their environment. But also we saw long-term trends that kind of matched as temperatures increase and also as sea ice decreases. These whales are making long-term decisions that do suggest there is a bit of adaptability in their migration patterns. But I have a lot of questions still about that. One of which is how will that change as prey distributions change? So in Southern California, which as you can see on the left there, this is krill, which has been increasing for decades off Southern California. So I have a question of how is that going to impact, as these whales are changing their migration timing? Are they going to maybe stay longer, stay earlier? Are they going to potentially stay all winter if the food is good? And then with bowhead whales, kind of how are their migration patterns going to change as sea ice shifts where copepods can be found? And then if you know anything about me, I talk about ship strike risk a lot. So one of the questions I have, of course, is if whales are changing not only their patterns, but their timing of migration, how is that going to impact risk in areas where there's already some risk? So for example, blue whales off Southern California are really at risk of ship strikes because that is where some very dense traffic goes through. So if they're staying longer, will that continue and increase ship strike risk? And then for bowhead whales, right now, there's not that many documented bowhead whales getting killed by ships. However, we are also seeing increase in vessel traffic through the Bering Strait. And so if whales are spending more time north of the Bering Strait, that could also increase ship strike risk. The other thing that's happening, until a few years ago, they had never documented blue whales being entangled at all. So this is a little video of a news coverage of trying to disentangle a blue whale off California. So if they're spending more time off California waters, maybe they're spending more time inshore when they didn't before, that could also increase entanglement risk. It's interesting though for bowhead whales. So what you're seeing on the right is a bowhead whale that has some entanglement scars. They're probably more at risk in the Bering Sea of entanglement. And so if they move north, they might actually be a little at less risk of entanglement. So it's not as cut and dry as all that, but it is really interesting to think about how their changes will change the risks that they face. Okay, so let's return to the migration argument. So we've got these two very different whales. Geiger et al., when he was classifying the different types of migration, of course, and we saw this with the blue whales, they have that traditional seasonal to and fro migration. They said that bowhead whales are seasonal dispersers, which is kind of like, because they don't really have this like very distinct migration pattern. There was a paper in 2008 by Ford and Reeves that talked about baleen whales either being fight or flight species. And he defined blue whales as a flight species, which they said they're fast moving and this allows them to flee killer whales. So instead of staying to fight or defend themselves, they can just take off. And he said they said that's why they're more dispersed in the winter, because then they can't be kind of a target for killer whales, but also maybe that's why they have that simpler song, because then they have to travel farther to get to those dispersed females. But they said that bowhead whales were a fight species, which we can debate at the end of this talk. But essentially they said they're slower moving, they might be able to fight killer whales. In their paper, they do actually have 5 records of bowhead whales in the eastern part of Canada, where they were at least being attacked by killer whales, with maybe one example of when the bowhead fought back, but these were like very old, visual observations. So thinking about that a lot. And then, they were saying that they aggregate in the winter, and it's probably why they have these complex songs. So like I said, very different populations, but potentially if it's all killer whale related, maybe it makes sense. So we have seen with blue whales, if they're moving in between these low latitude feeding grounds and low latitude breeding grounds, and we're like, okay, well, why are they going back to the breeding grounds? It could be very similar to what Pittman et al. In 2019 was saying, that this is for molting. This allows them to get to warm water so they can slough their skin. This is kind of a tenuous, but Corcoran and Connor said that, I mentioned this, that it's not resource tracking because they're not going to the breeding grounds to feed. However, there has been some evidence that when blue whales go to the Costa Rica Dome, they do feed. So, maybe it's both. But we're also seeing them, I just think it could be these things. It could also be predator avoidance. If they are, this flight species, maybe they do want to be out of the Southern California area to be away from killer whales. And the reason for that is because even though until recently, we hadn't really documented attacks or kills on blue whales by killer whales. And so this paper in Marine Mammal Science talked about 3 different examples, and it was off Australia, but one of the kills, there were 2 kills in 2019 and 1 kill in 2021. One of the kills in 2019 was an adult blue whale, which was crazy. It had never been documented before. And we are seeing more orcas off Southern California. So that's a really interesting thing to think about. I think as we're getting more blue whales increase and we're getting more killer whales, maybe it is that we're starting to see that historic pattern that we weren't seeing before. So there's just a lot of big changes coming, I think. And I think we're going to start seeing more attacks off Southern California, but I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. And then what's interesting in general with bowhead whales is that because of their unique migration, they're actually probably the least likely to encounter a killer whale, especially on their summer feeding grounds. But as the sea ice is melting, we're starting to get more and more killer whales move more north and then stay for longer. And so we have now started to see the first evidence of killer whale attacks on bowhead whales. So in some ways, if they stay further north, that actually might benefit them because it'll keep them out of the way of where killer whales are now spending more time. And I think that's, some people call that the ice as a refuge hypothesis, but maybe they have the right idea by staying farther north. And if you were like, well, wait, what about the molting hypothesis? Because bowheads don't go to warm waters. They're staying in cold waters all the time. This is some drone footage, again, from a different population, but it's the Eastern Canada population. And it was showing that they were going to these shallow water areas to roll around on the rocks so that they could actually use the rocks to help them kind of exfoliate, if you will. And so there's like the before and after on the left of the whale that use the rocks to clean its body. So potentially they don't need the warmer waters for that particular reason. And so I'll kind of wrap it up. I have some lasting questions. Are there different reasons that whales migrate? The different papers presented some really compelling reasons. I'm not sure if it's maybe one or the other, or maybe it's a combination of those different things. I think it's really important to ask, why do some populations not migrate? I think that could be really an interesting way to answer this question as well. How much can animal migration, especially whales, keep changing and shifting as the climate changes, as their prey distributions change? And will we start to see things like some of the non-migratory populations that I talked about, like fin whales off Southern California? Will they start migrating if their food starts shifting, or will we also see migratory populations completely stop migrating if their prey shifts in a way that it makes sense for them to stay somewhere? Will we also see that? But yeah, I think these are my lasting questions, and I will take your answers. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so very much. I have questions, but I'll try really hard to wait.
I have questions. I want yours.
Talk. So I want to start with any questions online, Roseanne. Not yet. How about questions in the room? All right.
First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very clear. I was wondering if you had time to perhaps compare and contrast what you told us about the blue whales migrating down to the dome of Costa Rica as compared to the gray whales going to the lagoons in Mexico.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, because they're down there calving and they're, you know, presumably that is a safe haven for them, especially because we know that that is a targeted species for killer whales. So I think in some ways that is a good example of the predation escape hypothesis, right? Because that does get them way out of the way. And the only time then that they're encountering killer whales, especially say in Monterey Bay, is when they have to cross over the deeper water. So yeah, I think that's a really good example, and potentially even a better example than maybe the blue whales, because gray whales are slower moving. They don't fight as much, although there's been some interesting observations of humpbacks fighting on their behalf, right, to protect them. So we don't know why. But yeah, I think that's a really good example to bring up. They're different. I think they're different in terms of their behavior than blue whales, but yeah, it could be a very similar reason.
Great. Roseanne, it looks like you have a question online.
Yes, great talk. Thank you. One question. What threshold do you use to define the arrival of blue whales at a certain location? Is it the first appearance of a call, or is it a certain number of calls per given time period?
Yes, it was a little bit complex. Yeah, I didn't really get into some of the basic analyses that I did, but it was a little tricky because, like I said, not every animal migrates. And so sometimes you would have a blue whale, like blue whales, just very low level calling throughout the winter. And we really wanted to say, what's the timing for the bulk of animals when they're there or not? So we ended up doing kind of a 95% distribution from the day with the peak number of calls. So essentially we had a cutoff on either end that we were able to say, this is probably when the bulk of animals are arriving and this is when they're ending. So yeah, hopefully that answers that.
All right, questions in the room? All right, then I get to ask my question. So I'm outside of the marine mammal world, but you were talking about temperature change the year before being an influencer on the timing of the whales to come back. So what is the trigger at the moment? Is it the memory of the temperature from before, or is there something in the environment now that gets them to move at a different time?
That's a great question. And I do think it's memory, to answer your question quickly, but what I was really hoping when I started that study was that there was something in real time that was triggering them, because I was like, if they're leaving, they have to make that decision on when to leave their breeding grounds, thousands of miles away. Like, is there something that they're queuing in at their breeding grounds that is telling them, you know, the environment's starting to change? But I didn't find any strong relationships with any of the variables I looked at from the Costa Rica dome. And it was only when we started looking at what's going on in Southern California that we started to see some strong relationships. And so basically what I was showing was that there's at least a year memory for these whales, but there have been studies that showed blue whales returning to the same areas with like really quality prey. And that was able to show that that can go back like a decade. So basically they were saying that whales can remember where good krill is up to 10 years, which is crazy. So yeah, so I think it's strongly memory driven.
That's really cool. Okay, Roseanne, looks like you have a question online.
Okay, very nice job. We tagged fin whales in the Med. Some stayed in and some left seasonally to the North Atlantic. Are they two different populations?
That's a good question. I don't know. Have to get some skin samples and run them through the genetics and see what's going on. But yeah, fin whales are a mystery.
I'll come back to the question, but we might have an answer. Yeah, hang on a second.
Have an answer? Yes.
We'll do this as a team.
You're getting more exercise. I think they are different populations in the Med and outside of the Med, and this is based on work that Manolo Castellote did for part of his PhD, where he looked at the interpulse intervals in fin whale song and found that they were very distinctly different. So sometimes whales from the Atlantic would nip into the Mediterranean and then go back out. So it seems that using acoustics, there are different populations.
Thank you. All right, question online, Roseanne? Okay, I know I'm supposed to go over there, but I have a question right here and that's easier.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. I just had a quick question on if any of your acoustic data was used for insight into navigation and how that possibly could be connected.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part?
Just how like possibly how they use acoustics to navigate and just any insight you have into how they navigate those long stretches.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think cultural transmission is one aspect. So they're probably, you know, the first year that the calf goes with its mother to the feeding grounds, they're kind of learning the routes. And they do show that, especially with some of the blue whales off Southern California, that they will repeatedly return to the same sites every year. And so they're not kind of going all over the place. Although they can change. We have definitely had some that will suddenly just go somewhere else. So that's one aspect of it. And then in terms of, yeah, so I had a question about that. And one of the things I tried to look at was like, are the blue whales maybe sending a scout that's like singing back to, or, you know, calling back to be like, hey, there's good food here. Wasn't able to find a good relationship, but I think there is some form of, as they're migrating as well, they're communicating with each other to help each other find food as well. So I think it's a combination of things.
All right, question in the room.
I think you just gave the answer, combination of reasons.
It's
right?
always
I
a
mean,
combination.
that's, you asked for that. I think that one's probably likely the case, as it is for most animals, right? They do things for a combination of reasons. And some of it's balance. But one of the things, and thank you very much for a great talk. I loved hearing the bowhead song. Tremendous, really, really interesting. You know, having experienced humpback song in real time and vibrating through my body. But question about one of the things that you said was that there was you thought that there might be an increase in the food and that it may actually be increasing. And you did show an increase in krill over time, but with the temperature, just wondering if you had other data that supported that sort of overall increase in food, sort of for the earlier timing.
Yeah, I don't have any current data to support that for the Arctic. And basically, we don't even know if it's necessarily increasing, but that there might be some years where there's more prey there. And so they decide to go over there. I really want to get Clarissa to start looking at some of the stable isotopes so we can see if they are feeding over there and on what as well, because it might be mostly krill over there. And maybe that's okay for some years if they want to supplement their diet. It also might just be, we don't know how many whales are going over there. We just know that some are. We don't know if it's adult males or, how they're kind of cutting up their different population when they're feeding. But yeah, I think it's just, there's some years, there's potentially more prey over there compared to, and they actually go back and forth. I was able to, look at kind of the migration patterns throughout that whole feeding season. And I think they're going between the Eastern Canadian Beaufort and then the Chukchi Sea to feed and kind of meander around and find food where they can.
All right, other questions in the room? I'm sorry, this is Daniel. It might be hard.
It's going to be a hard one. Come on.
No, it's not hard. It's a comment disguised as a question, or vice versa. So that Geiger paper that they reviewed migratory strategies and so forth. I haven't read it recently, so maybe you can clarify this for me. But one of the issues that I have with this idea of non-migratory populations is that it's really not the case, because when you look at them, just take, for instance, fin whales inside the Mediterranean or in the Gulf of California, they have very distinctive migration inside the basin. It just happens that the basin is small and therefore the migration is small. Same with the North Arabian humpback whales. These are very seasonal basins, and the whales will track a migration, tracking the resources inside those basins. It's just that they're small compared to polar to equatorial type distances of migration. So anyway, so that's the comment about that. So I'm always, like, it's not really true. But
Yeah.
anyway, in your review of that Geiger paper, which I think is the more recent one, that when they looked at that, do you have any insights into can we really call them non-migratory, or what were the elements or arguments that they used to call them non-migratory?
Yeah, I'm trying to recall. I think it is comparing. I think it was comparative to like the more traditional migration patterns. And I think you're right. I think a lot of these things are like, we kind of want to put things in a black box or in a category and be like, they either migrate or they don't. And so you might overlook some of the nuances there to try to say that. And similar to like saying, do they feed on their breeding grounds or not? I think a lot of times we just want to have these set paradigms, but we're, especially now, more as we learn more and more, we're seeing that that's not true, right? And even with fin whales off Southern California, it's similar, where they don't migrate, but sometimes they will leave the area. We don't necessarily know where they go, but they're moving somewhere else. They might not be taking these, bigger long distance migrations, but they're definitely moving around. So yeah, I think it's just there's a lot of nuance, and I think a lot of exceptions to the rules we try to put in place. So yeah.
Thank you.
Questions in the room? This is what happens when you don't ask questions, and I get to ask mine. So I am really curious to build a little on what Daniel was talking about instead of looking about why they migrate, but why they stay.
Exactly.
I think that is a really interesting question that might be able to refine some of the questions that we're struggling with. So is that work being done, or is that still something that we haven't really switched our brain to think about, from why they go to why they stay?
Right. I haven't seen much on that, but I think, as Daniel just said, like maybe it's because we're ignoring the fact that they do move around in their particular region. We're just not saying it's migration. So how do you kind of cut that up? But I think
a redefinition of migration.
Yeah. And maybe figure out why they stay in maybe a smaller area, but while acknowledging that they still do move around. I think it's kind of a tricky area. But I think it's a really interesting question. I wish that Bob had been here, because I was going to grill him on his 2019 paper, but he's not here, because I really want to know why they migrate and why they don't.
Right. All right. Going once. Any other questions online? Any other questions in the room? Thank you very much. I have been wanting this talk for a very long time, so I really am happy you're here. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us.